Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to take a short break from all the pushing into topple videos that I've been releasing over the last couple videos. Kind of really started with a rabbit hole I went down with the Path of the Giant Barbarian that kind of led me into different things. But today we're actually just going to look at a different mastery, and not really necessarily the mastery itself being the slow mastery, as you can tell by the screen, but just different effects that can cause incremental or total speed reductions, such as, reducing a creature's speed by 10 feet or 20 feet or whatever, having their speed. Technically, we also include things that reduce a creature's speed to 0, but really the goal is just kind of see, how many things can we stack? Are there enough things that you could reasonably stack on one character to really kind of push them all into one thing without making too many sacrifices, and that kind of being the only thing that you do? So today we're just going to look at all that and more. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and see what we're working with. So of course, we've been talking about prone, and prone is good, but with slow, it's better. It's easier than ever in 2024 to knock a creature prone with the topple mastery, the rules around pushing creatures into other creature spaces, knocking them prone that way. All the different kinds of shoves we have, from the basic rules, from the general rule shoves to special class features and spells and everything that can push creatures around, as well as just different spells, both old and new, like Tasha's Hideous Laughter or the new Yolanda's Regal Presence. All of these are different ways that we could potentially knock creatures prone. And I mean, even just between the topple mastery and pushing creatures into other creature spaces, creatures are going to be ending up prone more than they ever were in 2014 rules. And this is really just kind of even outside of optimized tables, where trying to get creatures prone was usually a strategy that you would want to employ. In 2024, because there are just so many sort of incidental ways for creatures to be prone, it can just happen even if you really aren't trying to optimize. You're just kind of using the rules as they are. So while I have spent the last couple of videos talking about, prone and pushing people into prone, I know at least one commenter was talking about how slow is very powerful as well, especially if you combine that with the prone condition, but also just, focusing on different slow effects as well, especially if you have a team composition around it, that can be just as oppressive as knocking creatures prone as well. So I wanted to look at just not all the different ways that we have in the game to reduce a creature's speed in some way, but also how easy it is to combine those effects to possibly reduce a creature's speed to 0. So if we knock them prone and we reduce their speed to 0, then they can't get up. So speaking of that prone rule, let's go and take a look at prone just to kind of remind ourselves how it works. So the prone condition hasn't changed in 2024 at all. The only way to get up from prone is to spend an amount of movement equal to half of your speed. Again, this is not half of your movement, as in half of your remaining movement. You must spend an amount of movement equal to half of your speed. So if you have a 30 speed, you need to have 15 feet of movement available for you in order to stand up. So if we were knocked prone and we wanted to crawl away, say 10 feet, that costs us twice our movement to do that. Even crawling 10 feet would cost us 20 feet of movement, and we would no longer have 15 feet of movement in order to stand up. So we would still be prone, but we'd just be further away from the person we were trying to get away from. While there are plenty of effects that can make moving more expensive, such as like difficult terrain and plant growth types effects where it costs more movement per foot of movement that you move, none of these affect the cost of standing up prone. The movement equal to half your speed is basically just attacks. It is not like movement in the sense that you are moving across or in a space. And also, most slow effects, if not all slow effects, basically just reduce a creature's speed. It doesn't reduce their movement, it reduces what their actual speed is. So for example, again, if you have a 30 speed and you get hit with a slow mastery weapon, that gets reduced to 20 speed. So if you're prone and you have the slow condition on you from the slow mastery, you can still spend 10 feet of movement to get out. And this would go all the way down to even 5 feet of movement if you, again, have 30 speed and have 25 feet of speed reduction on you. You would still technically be able to spend 2.5 feet of movement to stand up, rounded down to 2. You wouldn't be able to leave that square necessarily. The only way that you can't stand up is if you have 0 speed, because then you have nothing to sacrifice in order to stand up. Of course, there are many spells and effects that can impose things like the restrained condition, paralyzed, petrified, things like that. Those of course would also lock down a prone target, but usually, especially for paralyzed and petrified, you're casting those to do that thing. You don't care about whether they're prone or not. You could probably say the same for the restrained condition. That also kind of gives the same benefits as prone, in the sense that they are stuck in the space that they're in. You have advantage on attacks against them, and they have disadvantage on attacks against you. So for the purposes of this video, we're not really going to be considering things that restrain or paralyze or petrify or any of those effects that reduce a creature speed to 0. But we will look at some other effects that reduce a creature speed to 0, because that's basically all they do. We're just ignoring these ones because you'd be using those anyway, kind of regardless of whether or not they're prone. So before we get into all those effects, let's take a quick look at monster speeds, at least in the 2024 monster manual. So there's 505 or 502, just a little over 500 monster monsters in the 2024 Monster Manual. Basically, 75% of them have a base speed that is either greater than or equal to their alternate speed, that being like a fly, a swim, or a burrow speed. So this means that if you're able to reduce their base speed to 0, then you don't also have to worry about them taking off flying or burrowing or swimming away using a faster speed that has some speed left. So of these 75% of monsters in the 2024 Monster Manual, there's 11 of them at 60 feet, 27 of them at 50 feet, 87 of them at 40 feet, 191 at 30 feet. Of course, that's likely the most common, and there's definitely many more at 30 feet if you just include all possible, humanoid-ish races or species that you could be even as a player character as well. So definitely the lion's share of monsters or creatures that you would run into probably have a 30-foot movement speed. There's 1 at 25 feet, 31 at 20 feet, 1 at 15 feet, 11 at 10 feet, and 13 at 5 feet. This initial pull of monsters that I didn't include monsters who have slow movement speeds and a more reasonable fly speed, such as if they had a 5-foot movement speed and a 30-foot fly speed, which is much more reasonable to try to drop to 0. If we included those creatures, there'd be 13 additional monsters. Again, some of these monsters do have flight speed. Some of those flight speed creatures do have hover, but you would still be able to potentially stop them from moving in the air. Again, hover would prevent them from falling out of the air if their speed is reduced to 0, but you can still just stop them from moving, which is basically almost just as good. So with all that aside, let's just go ahead and get started. Let's look at some spells that we can use to possibly reduce a creature's speed, if not to 0, then at least incrementally. So when it comes to spells, we are going to look at some leveled spells here, but again, these are going to be much more situational because they have the cost of having that spell level be cast, as opposed to a different spell of that level as well. In a perfect world, we would just be mostly relying on things that we can do repeatedly, such as attacking or casting a cantrip, or just effects that are more passive. However, there are some very powerful effects in spells. There are probably even some higher ones than level 4, but I didn't want to go too high because at that point, you're definitely casting higher level spells for different reasons than locking a creature down. However, at 4th level spells, we have a very powerful standout here in Giant Insect in 2024. This is a 4th level spell with a 10-minute duration, and it requires concentration. Like many of the summon spells, they have different forms you can choose, and this one has a spider form that has basically a 60-foot range attack that it can do, that on hit, it just automatically reduces a creature's speed to 0. There's no saving throw, nothing. Their speed is 0 until the beginning of the insect's next turn or something along those lines, or until the end of their turn. Either way, they're not going anywhere on their turn. So extraordinarily powerful effect. You might be able to get 2 combats in that duration if you're going back to back. On one hand, I'm like, wow, they made the spell kind of way too powerful, but also it is much shorter than many of the other sort of summons, but still extraordinarily strong 4th level spell for that purpose. Also in our 4th level spells, and kind of a big step down from the Giant Insect, is the Summon Construct. Of course, this one does last 1 hour, so it lasts 6 times longer than the Giant Insect spell. If you choose the Stone form of the Summon Construct, creatures within 10 feet of it who fail a Wisdom saving throw each turn will have their speed halved for that round, basically. So obviously features that have a creature speed are very powerful on their own, and it kind of scales with creatures who have faster speed, because of course it's going to reduce more speed the faster that they are, especially because fast creatures usually rely on being fast as a part of their kit. So if you're able to punish that, it's going to be particularly crippling for them, whereas if you have a creature speed who only has a speed of 10 feet, they're kind of already built around being slow in general, so it's not quite as punishing for them. Speaking of effects that can have a creature speed, there's Spirit Guardians. Spirit Guardians, of course, is a pretty bread and butter spell for the cleric, or any subclass that can get access to it that is not specifically the cleric. This one, of course, halves the speed of affected creatures within the radius with no additional saving throw. The saving throw is just for the damage. So if you're able to get creatures in that space and keep them in that space, and their speed will constantly be halved, which can be a good setup to layer additional slow effects on top of to try to keep them in that radius. And it is a 15-foot radius, so there's a lot of room for the cleric to kind of stay maybe just out of their melee range to kind of keep concentrating on that Spirit Guardians and work with their team to kind of keep the creature pinned in place as much as possible. Also at a 3rd level spell like Spirit Guardians, we have the slow spell. This spell also has affected creatures' speed as well based on a failed save. There's many other reasons that you would cast the slow spell. There's -2 to their AC. They can only take 1 attack if they take the attack action, things like that. Disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. There's a lot of good reasons to cast the slow spell outside of just having their speed, but this is another option that you could choose. Another pretty potent option at 3rd level for the Wizard and Warlock specifically would be Summon Shadow Spawn. Similar to the Summon Construct, this is a 1-hour duration with concentration. The Despair form has a feature that says when a creature starts their turn within 5 feet of it, their speed is reduced by 20 feet. The only creature that this doesn't affect is you, so your allies will have to try to maneuver around it and not start their turn within 5 feet of the shadow spawn. But outside of the having speed effects and outside of these effects that can reduce a creature speed just to 0, I think this is one of the most powerful just incremental reduction effects. Is just a flat 20 feet. If you're able to even add just a 10-foot speed reduction on top of that, again, you are affecting probably half the creatures in the game, locking them down to 0. Of course, the shadow spawn is a creature that exists and it can be destroyed, which can end that effect early, but still a very powerful, potent effect. And it is, again, just a creature on its own with its own attacks. So not only is it really slowing down the creatures, but it can also be offensive on its own. You know, it can be absorbing attacks that would otherwise be going to your allies, while also just, again, slowing them down and kind of keeping them in place. Again, at 3rd level, we have Spirit Shroud, which is sort of playing like second fiddle to Spirit Guardians, although these usually aren't on the same spell lists. This one lasts 1 minute with concentration, and creatures who start their turn within 10 feet of you have their speed reduced by 10. You know, it is only a reduction of 10 feet, but sometimes that extra 10 feet will be all you need. And really, any sort of slower movement is always welcome. I mean, that's 2 less squares that they can move on a standard map. Lastly, we have the cantrip Ray of Frost. This one is available to Artificers, Sorcerers, and Wizards. And of course, in 2024, this is basically available to anyone who wants it through the Magic Initiate Wizard origin feat. It's certainly not a bad one to pick up for exactly situations like this. There really aren't that many spells at levels 1 and 2. I mean, you know, there are things like Ensnaring Strike that can reduce a creature speed to 0. That's something that you can consider as well, especially if a creature's prone. You can kind of ensnare them prone. Rhyme's Binding Ice, I think, is another one that can reduce a creature speed to 0, at least for 1 turn. I think that's like a 2nd level spell that you can consider. It's like basically like a mini Cone of Cold, essentially. But as far as sort of the lowerish tier of spells that are still pretty potent as far as repeatedly, consistently trying to keep a creature speed down, I would say that these are probably your biggest standouts. So with the spells aside, let's go ahead and move on to the feats. There's actually quite a number of feats that we can use to lower a creature speed. Again, a lot of them are going to come from Bigby Presents Glory of the Giants. There's a lot of good stuff as far as feats goes from that one, starting with Soul of the Storm Giant. This requires the Strike of the Giants feat, which you can get either from picking it up as a normal feat if you have the martial weapon proficiency, or if you have the Giant Foundling background, sort of as an origin feat. This feat has a bonus action that lasts for 1 turn that causes creatures that start their turn within 10 feet of you during that next round until the beginning of your next turn to make a strength save or have their speed halved. So it's sort of a 1 round sort of Spirit Guardians effect, but they get to make a save against it. And you can do this a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus per long rest. So while we would definitely prefer something like Spirit Guardians instead, because it simply has no saving throw and it lasts longer, for classes that would either just not normally have access to Spirit Guardians, or for classes like the Barbarian who just don't work well with spells, this is actually a pretty decent option. And you get it, again, proficiency bonus times per long rest. So that's going to scale with you as you level up. And especially if you're also able to get bigger, like the Path of the Giant Barbarian or the Rune Knight Fighter, or even just like in a large spell, any sort of effect like that, that 10-foot emanation is going to cover more squares as you get bigger. Moving to one of the other giant feats, we have Fury of the Frost Giant. This one gives you a reaction that you can use when you're damaged by an attack roll. You can force that creature to make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail, they take some cold damage and you reduce that creature's speed to 0 until the end of its next turn. So that's not until the end of their current turn, but their next turn. So basically a full round that they're not able to move. That one is a reaction, so that one would be a little harder to use, especially on a prone creature, because that would mean that they have to be prone, attacking you from prone, which they're likely not to do if they had the chance to stand up first. Not saying that that couldn't happen, but it's much less likely, much less reliable. However, Fury of the Frost Giants is the only sort of one of these Bigby Presents Glory of the Giants feats that kind of directly pairs with its Strike of the Giants version of it. So the Strike of the Giants, again, is sort of the lower level origin feat. It is the prerequisite for the higher level feats. So if you choose Strike of the Giants and you choose Frost, basically a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus per long rest, when you hit with a melee attack or a thrown weapon attack, you can deal extra cold damage on hit, force them to make a Constitution saving throw, and if they fail that save, then their speed is also reduced by 0 until the end of your next turn. So if you have both Strike of the Giants Frost and Fury of the Frost Giants, you basically have a double whammy that you can force it on your turn when you hit them with an attack with a melee weapon or thrown weapon attack, or if they hit you, you can force them to make that con save as a reaction and then reduce their speed to 0 again. Moving away from the giant feats, we get to Slasher, of course. This is a pretty well-known one. Once per turn, when you hit with an attack that deals slashing damage, it can be any attack. It could be a spell attack that somehow does slashing damage. It could be a weapon attack that does slashing damage, any form of slashing damage, as long as it's an attack. You can reduce the affected creature's speed by 10 feet. The Slasher feat is actually a little bit stronger than the Slow Mastery in the sense that it can not only stack with itself on different turns, so this is once per turn, not once per turn on your turn. So if you hit a creature once on your turn, that's 10 feet, and then if you get a reaction like an opportunity attack on them, that will be an additional 10 feet. So there's a potential of 20 feet just from this attack alone. Unlike the Slow Mastery, which cannot stack with itself or even different instances of the Slow Mastery from, other players or something like that. Whereas Slasher can not only stack with itself on different turns from you, but if other players also have Slasher slashing attacks and have the slasher feat, they can also do that as well. Finally, there's the old but gold Sentinel. This one is of course probably the premier feat for reducing a creature speed by dropping it to 0 when you hit them with an opportunity attack. This one is actually even stronger in 2024 because the reaction attack that you get when a creature within 5 feet of you attacks a creature other than you now also counts as an opportunity attack, and it is specifically the opportunity attack that when you hit with it reduces a creature speed to 0. So not only is it normal opportunity attacks, but you now have this special opportunity attack if a creature next to you decides to attack someone other than you. So those are all the feats. Let's look at some class features. I don't think there are too many, and we've kind of covered a couple of them in the previous videos as well. Of course, there's the Barbarian Brutal Strike. We've covered this one. We've covered the other half of this one in my previous videos where we're talking about the Brutal Strike that can push a creature 15 feet. The other half of that feature, which is available to any Barbarian as long as they're level 9, is that when you hit a creature with the Brutal Strike, you can also choose to reduce their speed by 5 feet. Again, this is only once per turn and it's only on your turn, but that is the other side of the coin of the Brutal Strike. So you can either push them 15 feet or you can reduce their speed by 15 feet, which is a pretty significant chunk. I mean, again, this is something that you can repeat every turn. It doesn't really cost a resource other than you needing to be attacking recklessly and you need to give up the advantage on that recklessness, but otherwise it's effectively free. The second one would be the Fighter's Tactical Master. This one also comes on at level 9. This one gives the fighter the ability to replace whatever the mastery they're using on their current weapon with either slow, push, or sap. They get to choose that each time that they attack or hit the creature. And for the slow mastery specifically, this feature is actually kind of surprisingly powerful because there really aren't many great melee weapons that have the slow mastery on them. And if you're trying to combine the slow mastery with the slasher feat, your only option without this feature would be the whip. But if you're able to place the slow mastery on any weapon that you're using, that opens you up for things like the glaive or the greatsword, which have graze. So graze only happens if you miss, whereas all these, the slow, sap, and push only happen if you hit. So if you miss, you just do graze. If you hit, you can do push, slow, or sap. I think that's a really cool combination. Of course, you can also do it with like cleave with like the halberd or the great axe. If you want to topple with a slashing weapon, you would need to use the battle axe. Unfortunately, there's no bigger weapon that has it. But as a fighter, you have plenty of masteries to choose from, and it's pretty easy to swap out weapons in combat anyway, especially if you're just doing, you know, a 1-to-1 switch. So you can switch from a topple to a cleave to a graze into a slow or whatever pretty easily. For the Warlock, we have the pre-2024 Invocation Lance of Lethargy. This one makes it so that when you hit a creature with Eldritch Blast once per turn, you can reduce their speed by 10 feet. Basically turns it into a pseudo Ray of Frost without needing to cast Ray of Frost or a no Ray of Frost. Finally, there's the Conquest Paladin's Aura of Conquest that they get at level 7. This one can cause creatures in their aura who are frightened to also have their speed reduced to 0. So this one is, of course, much more conditional, but if you're trying to just generally control enemies' movements, fear effects are pretty powerful. The Fear spell, the level 3 Fear spell, is also very powerful. I usually see Aura of Conquest combined with the Warlock subclass, the Undead one, with the form of Dread. That allows you once per turn when you hit a creature with an attack to force them to make a Wisdom saving throw or be frightened. That combos very well with the Aura of Conquest Paladin. Of course, if you're trying to do that in 2024 where subclasses come online at level 3, you would need to be a level 10 character total for 7 levels of Paladin and 3 levels of Warlock. But you could still technically pull that off. It just comes online just a little bit later. There might be other class features that can also help. I couldn't find, spot, or think of any off the top of my head with the browsing and kind of research that I was doing, but if I missed any, definitely let me know down in the comments. We're starting to wrap this up. Let's go ahead and just kind of talk about the general rules. Of course, we've talked about one of them already. That is, of course, the slow mastery. For most melee characters, at least, the slow mastery isn't really the greatest option because there aren't a lot of good melee weapons for the slow mastery, these being the club, the javelin, and the whip. The club is something that you could build around if you're using the Shillelagh cantrip, either as like a ranger with your druidic fighting style, or if you just picked up the Magic Initiate Druid origin feat to get Shillelagh that way. That is something you could certainly do. But for the ranged weapons, of course, you have the light crossbow, the sling, the longbow, and the musket. The longbow is definitely the standout here as far as just raw damage goes as well. Not only is it one of the higher damage dies, but it is a two-handed heavy weapon, so you could, again, combo that with great weapon masters. Finally, the other sort of general rule that can affect a creature's speed is exhaustion. This in 2024 reduces a creature's speed by 5 feet per exhaustion level. This is, of course, much more situational because there really aren't a whole lot of ways to impose exhaustion on creatures outside of the normal, Sickening Radiance shenanigans or using the Dream spell to make it so that a specific creature that maybe you're going to fight later can't get a night's rest and they're going to have exhaustion because of it. But outside of those cases, there's not really a whole lot of cases for exhaustion. So those are at least the majority of rules around slowing down creatures in 2024. Again, you have things like restrain, you have things like difficult terrain and all that as well. But we were just really looking at features that are meant to just lower a target speed by a fixed amount, whether it's half the speed, 10 feet, 20 feet, 15 feet, or just 0 feet, period, without also having additional effects like the restrained condition or the petrified condition or the paralyzed condition. So with all that, let's go ahead and wrap up into my final thoughts here. So overall, I think going for incremental speed reduction is a lot of work to commit to on one character. However, if you either plan ahead with your party, or if you're just kind of playing and you kind of notice that many of your party members have a number of these different effects that we kind of went over, or maybe some that I missed, you may begin to sort of coordinate around them and kind of really be able to turn maybe some much more difficult combats around, especially combats that take place in very large maps with creatures who are maybe relying on their speed to get around. Because even if you aren't pinning a creature prone by reducing their speed to 0 with enough effects that do that, reducing a creature's speed even by 20 or even 30 feet, which is reasonable even on, certain builds with one character, you could do that. That will reduce the majority of creatures' speed to 0 if you can get up to that 30 feet. If not, 30 feet is still pretty debilitating for the vast majority of creatures. And even if you can't pin them prone, even if you can't reduce their speed to 0, and you're just reducing their speed to maybe 10 feet or 20 feet, you're also able to combine that with effects that make movement more costly, such as difficult terrain, such as plant growth effects. That can be effectively as good as reducing their speed to 0 if they're able to move 5 feet, if they're not even able to move 5 feet, but they still technically have speed. Again, that's effectively 0. And of course, maybe the elephant in the room that some people were thinking about already is grappling. Grappling, of course, is still possible in 2024. It's just not quite as good as it was previously in 2014. And this is because, of course, it's just based on a save DC. It's not based on that athletics contest anymore. So there's no way for a player to improve that save DC outside of just trying to raise their strength above 20, which isn't really feasible outside of very specific magic items or being like a level 20 barbarian, for example. So that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. I might look at like some very specific builds that can try to be a menace with speed reductions and things like that. Let me know what you think about anything I covered in this video down in the comments below. Again, if there are any features that I missed or higher level spells or just kind of cool combinations, I can't quite always get everything in the time that I have to put these videos together with everything else that I have going on. So I absolutely appreciate all the feedback that you guys give me on the comments, or additional just cool ideas that you guys give me in the comments as well. So of course, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.